This week's lesson is the fossil record. So it's a little bit different from when we did it in earth science, but there are some similarities throughout this lesson. So the lesson question for this lesson is, how does the fossil record support the theory of evolution? So we're looking at that change in species as through geologic time. So this will be the review part. How does a fossil form? And then how a scientist determine the age of the fossil. This is some new information. And then how the fossil record indicates a long history of changing life forms. So we touched on this a little bit during fossils in earth science, but it'll go into more detail about that. So our vocabulary words for this lesson, we have radioactive element, an element that releases energy as it breaks down into a stable element. Absolute dating, the process of determining the actual age of an event or fossil in years. Fossil record, the historical sequence of fossils found in Earth's rock layers. Sediment, small pieces of rock. Cast, a fossil formed when a mold fills with minerals and sediments. Relative dating, the process of putting events or fossils in order from oldest to youngest without using actual dates. Trace fossil, a fossil that shows the activity of ancient organisms. Mold, a fossil formed when the hard parts of an organism dissolve, leaving behind an empty space. Descend, to come from. An ancestor, a single organism from which other organisms have descended, have come from, descended. So our review here on fossils, a fossil is the preserved remains or evidence of an organism. Fossils can be used to document changes in organisms over time and identify extinct species. So here are the steps of fossil formation. Remember, this does take millions of years to complete. It is not a fast process. So step one, the organism has to die. So fossils are dead organisms. Step two, the remains of that the remains of that organism fall to the bottom of the ocean or a lake. So they need to be present in some form of ocean or lake. And then the soft parts of the organisms, like the skin and the internal organs, any of those soft parts, they typically break down. And so still part of step three, the hard portions like bones or shells are preserved. So if you're looking at like a crab or some other kind of sea form, the soft parts of that, that crab or something are going to break down, and then the hard part is going to be what is preserved. And then step four is layers of sediment cover the organism. So remember, this is like in the ocean or a lake, and so sediments are going to cover over that dead organism. And then step five is eventually it's going to become a rock. Okay, so those are your steps to creating a fossil. The types of fossils are molds, and the hard parts of an organism dissolve and it leaves an empty space in the shape of the organism behind, or a cast. So the mold fills with sediment and minerals, and so it makes a solid copy of the organism's shape. There's pictures of molds and casts in the folder if you want to look and see the difference between those in picture form. So minerals can replace the remains of an organism and change them into a rock. And organisms can leave imprints on sediment, which later hardens into a rock. So if you remember, that's trace fossils, and I believe that's where we're going on the next page here. So trace fossils show the activity of ancient organisms, like a footprint or scat or just a burrow, something like that. Fossils can also be preserved in substances other than sediment. So that's when we learned about the amber fossils or the tar fossils, the permafrost and ice, ways that they are also preserved. Then we go into how do we actually date them. So how do scientists date them? There's two ways. The first one is called relative dating, This is the process of putting the events or fossils in order from oldest to youngest without using actual dates. So they don't know the specific date of them, but we're putting them in a relative date. So the locations of the fossils within the rock layers indicate which fossils are older than others. And so here's our picture to take a look at that. The lower the rock layer, the older the fossil. So down here in the bottom, if we know that this layer is about 700 million years old, and we know that this layer is maybe 500 million years old, we know that these fossils are somewhere in between that age range, and any fossils that we find up here at the top are going to be younger than these fossils down here at the bottom, which are older. So again, the fossils toward the bottom are older than the fossils towards the top. Then a little side note on this relative dating is there's no limit to the age range of the fossils being dated, like with absolute dating, which we're going to learn about in just a minute. We can date things that are way down below this 700 million years if we find fossils that are older than that. We just know we don't know an exact date that these fossils were preserved, but we know if we can date some of the rock layers in between. So there's no limit to that range of dates, though, for relative dating. Now, when we go on to absolute dating, this process determines the actual age of an event or fossils. And we do that because it relies on radioactive elements that are in the rocks and in the fossils. So radioactive elements release energy as they break down into stable elements. And scientists know how long this process takes for different elements to go from an unstable radioactive element into a stable element. When we measure the amount of radioactive element versus the amount of stable element, then we can indicate the age of a fossil. And I don't believe this lesson doesn't go into like how to actually do that. It's some other chemistry formulas that you have to do. This just talks about how we can do absolute dating by calculating the amount of radioactive element versus the amount of stable element, and then that can give us an age. So here are some of the different elements we use for absolute dating. So we use a carbon-nitrogen ratio if it's a fossil that's not too terribly old. So 50,000 years is about the end result for our carbon elements. Potassium to argon, so the ratio of potassium to argon in a sample. These ones can be anywhere from about 100,000 to 4.5 billion year old samples. And then uranium to lead, there's much longer half-life on this one, so it's 10 million to 4.5 billion year old samples. Potassium to argon is going to be the more commonly used one in this examples. So that is absolute dating, where we actually find a specific date for a fossil using the ratios of radioactive elements to stable elements. What do we do with this fossil record? Well, the fossil record provides information on the history of life on Earth. We talked about this during the earth science lesson about knowing the age and location of the fossils. Scientists can see how organisms have changed, which organisms lived during the same time period, so we can see like which dinosaurs lived at the same time. And then they can also talk about which organisms may have a common ancestor. So that means like, you know, your great-great-great-great-grandpa may be somebody that you don't know also is from your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa. And so that's what they mean by a common ancestor. Way back when some species had the same ancestor, and so these organisms have descended. Remember, descended was have come from that common ancestor. Here's our geologic time. We looked at this on a football field last time too, where the first bacteria was back here around the 30-yard line. First cells with actual nucleus, so here's our start of our eukaryotes. First multi-celled organisms like plants and fungi and other organisms developed into multi-cell. And then as we get closer to the end zone, which is our current time, we see our first insects and then our first mammals and then our first humans right along this line here. So it says it is important to note that the fossil record is not complete. Some organisms cannot be preserved, mainly because they have soft bodies that decay before they could be preserved. So it did state something about there's little evidence in between the start of the Earth, 4.6 billion years ago, and when we finally see the first bacteria. And that's where it's talking about scientists believe it's because most of those organisms could not be preserved and or their preserved fossils have been destroyed by plate tectonics. So then it starts talking about how we actually use fossils as evidence for evolution, so as evidence of changing species. So you can see here sponges, they're one of the oldest known fossils, way back when the Earth was mostly just marine species. And then we have fish that came along, and then amphibians came along quite a bit later, reptiles, and then we know that mammals are some of the youngest fossils on Earth. And so this progression of water species, and then water and land species, water and land species, and then land species here. Fossil evidence of evolution. So the fossil record shows evidence of how the reptile skull changed over time. So at one point, reptiles had no eye holes, no holes behind the eyes. And then this fossil, quite a bit years later, had one hole behind the eye. And then this fossil has two holes behind the eye. So this just shows that the skull changes through time as the reptile develops stronger jaws. So this talks about the eye hole, but also another thing we can see in the fossil evidence is stronger jaws as reptiles developed. Fossil record review. When an organism dies, the remains fall to the bottom of the ocean or a lake, and then layers of sediment cover the organism, eventually becoming a rock or fossil. Types of fossils: molds, casts, where minerals replace the organism's remains. We have imprints or trace fossils, or organisms can be preserved in tar, ice, or amber. When we determine the age of a fossil, we use either relative or absolute. So relative is based on where we find it in the rock layer, and absolute is dating that amount of radioactive element compared to the amount of stable element. What can scientists do? Well, knowing about these fossils, we can see how organisms have changed, ones that are maybe along that common ancestor, which organisms lived during the same time period, and which organisms that we no longer see on Earth, which means they've become extinct. Our vocabulary words for this lesson that we chose for our FAIR model. So we have the process of determining the actual age of an element or an event or fossil in years. That's called absolute dating. We use radioactive elements in the fossils. 3 examples of how they do that: they use carbon to nitrogen change, potassium to argon change, and uranium to lead change. Remember, we're starting with those radioactive elements. The second word then is our relative dating. So this is the process of putting the events or the fossils from oldest to youngest without using actual dates. We know that the lower the rock layer, the older the fossils are, the higher up the rock layer, the younger. So older down here, younger up here. We do know that fossils, if they're found in the same layer, should be about the approximate same age when you're talking about relative dating. There's your fossils.